And other types of events might relate more to innovation and technology. So, as an example, we can mention the fact that Kodak actually invented the digital photography, but was unable to exploit it, and therefore eventually was outcompeted by Sony and Canon. Um, Another example could be the fact that Apple introduced the iPod, and together with the ability to get music from the iTunes store, actually eventually out-competed the MP3 players. So just to mention that there are different types of risks, and they are exemplified in many different types of events that we have seen happen over time. Now, the interesting thing is, that's why I switch here on the slide, you'll see that some of the first ones we talked about, like the trading and investment, really relate to financial and economic conditions. And you could argue that they constitute a particular type of risk exposures because they relate to conditions where you actually have quite a bit of information, price information, and so forth. And there are ways in which you can hedge. But obviously, you can also take larger positions in these. So it is a thing you have to keep an eye on and that you have to manage actively. There are also situations where you relate more to operational risk, that is, things that happen inside the organization. Say the way you report things, where you're dependent on the people that actually do things in the organization. And also along the supply chain, how you actually deal with different potential events around the supply chain, which is more focused around the ability to control your internal processes. And then down to things like innovation and new technologies that arise around you as a business. You could refer to these more as strategic exposures, and they are obviously exposures that you cannot exert much control over, but you need, in order to deal with them, to be more innovative yourself, be cognizant about what is happening, and be able to come and develop proper responses to deal with these changing circumstances. You will notice also, of course, that in terms of calculating or identifying exactly what the exposure is, provided that we see the exposures, becomes increasingly difficult the more you move towards operations and strategic type of exposures, as opposed to those that deal with financial and economic conditions where the data is much richer. So how do we try to deal with, or how can we think about how to deal with these type of exposures? Well, in principle, the idea, or one foundational idea, is quite simple. You try to lean back and you try to identify in advance what are the things that might hit us. Because if you do that, you might also have a higher chance of trying to respond to it. So you can express that. Here we call it the generic risk management process, or the generic risk management cycle, if you will, because it's a repetitive process that you can do over time, on and off, in a continuous way. So first, you would try to identify, right? Being aware and conscious about what might happen is the first step. You might analyze it. What does this imply for us? How important is it? You evaluate what can be done about this. What are the consequences of different ways of dealing with this? And then you make a decision as to how you want to respond, and you try to activate your responses and monitor what is going on. And that's really illustrated in this little nice circular process, where you could argue that you initially look at risk identification. You try to identify those risks that might affect you. You engage in risk analysis. You try to understand what is the potential effect of these exposures the risk will impose on you, and you try to assess those risks. Are they all important, or are these? I want to look maybe for these 5 or 10 risks that are really important and try to prioritize. So you analyze the risk and you try to figure out what is important for me to focus on in order to try to avoid the major consequences, negative consequences, but also take advantage of the potential opportunities they might offer going forward. You evaluate, you engage in risk evaluation. So in other words, based on the analysis, you think through different ways in which you can deal with these identified risks or exposures. So it could be that you might want to insure for certain losses. You might want to mitigate conditions in the organization so the exposures are reduced. You might simply stop doing certain things in order to eliminate the risks, and then you will have a residual risk that you need to manage. So once you've done this evaluation, of course, you have to enact it. So you respond in the appropriate way after you've done the evaluation. You engage in risk responses, and you effectuate what you decided your possible or the best responses were, and you will monitor this process and ensure that you actually also do complete what you intended to do. And this is an ongoing process, circular process. So periodically, you will go through this process in order to make sure that you observe new things that happen around you, so you're always reasonably updated. And you'll do this repetitively or regularly over time at a certain frequency. Now, at what frequency? Well, it depends on how rapidly the environment is changing around you. So if you're in a relatively stable industry, maybe you do it once a year. If it's more dynamic, maybe you do it once a quarter or once a month, or maybe even on a daily basis.